Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes. Welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast, everyone. My name is Nate Pfluger, and I also have my co-host here with me today, Dr. Andy Little. And today we are lucky enough to get to speak to Chris Helzer, who is actually the Nebraska Director of Science and Stewardship with the Nature Conservancy. So, Chris, I'll kick it over to you to introduce yourself and let everybody know what we're talking about today.
Sure. Hey, everybody. I've been with the Nature Conservancy about 28 years. I started as a land manager, and that's still really where my passion is, but I also do a lot of science and outreach work. So we thought today I'd talk a little bit about what grassland habitat looks like and why it's important and how it relates to ecological resilience.
So I've been following quite a bit of your work, Chris, and obviously you deal quite a bit with grasslands and prairies in general. What started you down the path of your love for prairies?
You know, it's interesting. I grew up, a lot of my elementary school years were out in Bridgeport, Nebraska, out in the Panhandle. And I was lucky. My family and my dad liked to go fishing. My mom was a bird watcher, so I spent a lot of time outdoors, but honestly never thought about grasslands or prairies because I was at a lake where we were camping under some trees. And it's really embarrassing to know that until I got to college, prairie as a concept wasn't really something I thought about. And it was a friend in college who asked me one day about whether I ever thought about prairies, and I had to say no. And he said, "Isn't that weird? There's a lot of people like that, and we live in a prairie state." And that really struck me. And at the time, at least, there weren't a lot of other people thinking about grasslands, even at the university, in terms of wildlife, which is what I was studying. And so it kind of became a cause for me, and I dove right in and learned everything I could learn.
That's awesome.
Very neat. So one of your big things that you talk on is wildlife habitat within prairies, and that it's diverse. It's not, wildlife habitat doesn't look the same across the board. We have a number of different species out there that require a number of different habitat types. Is that correct?
Right. Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, when they think about grasslands, especially if they're like me as a kid, you just sort of think of them as this one thing, right? It's just a prairie is a big flat area full of grass.
Yeah.
And I think from a producer standpoint, a lot of ranchers I talk to, if they think about wildlife habitat, what they really are thinking about a lot of times is leaving a little extra grass in a pasture because that's important for habitat, right? And which is true, by the way. That is an important habitat to have some areas of more dense grass than you might otherwise leave there. But grassland habitat is like you said, really variable, and it's all the different variations are very important. I think if you think about a woodland, people can think about like the canopy of trees up high, and then there's like a sub canopy of smaller trees, and you have a shrub layer maybe, and you've got the herbaceous grasses and wildflowers and then a leaf layer below that. And I don't know that people translate that into grasslands as much, but a lot of those sorts of structures are present in grasslands, and a tall, dense, vegetation structure is going to be great for some wildlife and nearly impenetrable for others. And in the reverse, an area with a lot of short grass and exposed bare soil is crucial habitat for a lot of species. And so the whole range in between that tall and very short and all the patchy, weird stuff in between, all of it matters and all of it's important.
Sure. Yeah. And I know, like, just thinking about that diversity, I think that's so key because it's easy to say, look at, like, for example, a CRP field, we'll use as an illustration, and say, okay, that's where I hunt in the fall, and therefore that's what it needs. We just need that throughout 365 days of the year. And it's like, well, no, that we need to have a lot of diversity in that. And that's great to illustrate that point, Chris. I really appreciate that because I think that's important to think about when you're managing for wildlife. It's a 365-day a year approach. And thinking about what their needs are. They, as you mentioned, bare ground for a great illustration, or some species that require that. Other species may need taller grass at certain points of the year. And so thinking about that diversity is such a critical aspect. And sometimes we don't necessarily think about it because we just, like you said, drive by a patch and say, well, that's prairie. But it's actually more, and I think that's the cooler part is when you actually get in there and kind of look around and starting to see that diversity, and you start recognizing, oh, it's more than just grass that's a few feet tall. It could be a lot of different things going on in there. And so I think
Yep.
it's a really great point to illustrate. Appreciate that.
Well, and I think for us is habitat and wildlife nerds, we like to think about it from a wildlife habitat standpoint and diversity of habitat. But from a ranching standpoint, I mean, they need to look at it as a way to create diversity, to add resilience back into the system, to, I mean, make their operation profitable. Correct,
Yeah,
Chris?
for sure. Absolutely. And I think the the more species of plants you have, for example, in a grassland system, the more resilient that grassland is and it becomes important if you have a dry spell or if you get a lot of rain, you got some standing water out there for a while, you need to have plant species that are going to be able to respond well in those situations. And the more species you have, the more redundancy is sort of built into the system, and you're more prepared for those kinds of situations. And that's not even talking about, the need for legumes and other wildflower species and the minerals and the nutrients that they put into the soil and put into livestock. Um, all of those things matter. And so the more of those species you have, the more redundancy there is in that network.
And for those that may not be familiar with prairies or the term resilience, can you describe that a little better for them?
Sure. I mean, resilience to me, the way I think about it at least, is it's the ability of a place, a prairie in this case, to be able to sort of take whatever comes at it, whether that's different weather variations or grazing situations or fire, absorb it, adapt to it, and still produce the habitat that's needed for all the wildlife species that are there to be productive in terms of forage for animals that are eating plants, to maintain its identity
Hmm.
as that prairie and support all the things that it always supports. Or if you think about a resilient prairie, it can look very different from day to day or year to year, but it is still sort of, it has that basic identity. And you can push it too far, right? You can push a grassland. For example, you could plow up a prairie and plant it to soybeans. Um, and that's not the same prairie anymore. And not only that, but if you stop planting soybeans and just let it sit, that prairie doesn't come back to what it was before. It's lost its identity. It's now something different. And it doesn't just come back because you stop doing whatever you were doing. That's not the case with fire or grazing most of the time. But even with those things, that's a good example. I mean, you could, I think everybody has seen examples of chronic overgrazing, right? You hit it so hard with grazing over and over and over that it does sort of change into something that's different. And if you then lay off the grazing, it doesn't bounce back to what it was before. It has crossed a threshold and it's now something completely different. So resilience is the ability of a system or a grassland to sort of resist going over that threshold.
And so you kind of touched on some of the man-made implications that we can put in place or how we can affect it. And we'll get into a little more of those later. But what causes habitat diversity within grasslands that's uncontrollable from our ends?
Sure. I mean, topography and soils are really good examples. Uh, a south-facing slope is going to have warmer temperature conditions. The soil is going to be warmer, drier. And so you'll end up with different plant species, for example, that grow on a south side of a slope than the north side of a slope. If you've got sandy soils versus more loamy soils or clay soils, that's going to affect the different kinds of plant species that grow there. And because you're affecting the plant species that grow there, it's going to provide a different sort of habitat structure because if on a drier slope, you might have shorter plants and maybe more sparse growth and there's more space in between them, more bare soil, just because it's a dry slope. So if it's a sandy south-facing slope versus, the bottom of a valley where you've got a lot of heavier soils and all the water sort of settles there after a rainstorm, you're going to have more dense vegetation. So you got variation across space just because of factors like that.
And then, so you mentioned animal impact, so grazing, and you do quite a bit with different grazing systems at TNC, is that correct?
Yeah, both with cattle and bison, we do a lot of grazing for sure. And the grazing interacts with everything I just talked about, right? Whether it's cattle or bison, they're going to treat a hilltop and a valley very differently, depending on what kinds of plants they're looking for, what state of growth those plants are in, if they're young and tender or old and mature, and whether they want a lot in a bite or a little bit in a bite. All those things matter, and so the topography affects the grazers, and then the grazers can sort of compound on top of that and can change the vegetation structure. And then you throw in things like fire or just, fences and moving them around the landscape. And we as people then sort of put our impact on the way that the grazers are interacting already with the environment. And it all sort of comes to this be really interesting, complex cycle of impacts.
That's interesting.
Can you touch on the different grazing systems or how us as humans affect how cattle graze within
sure.
our grasslands?
There's a few sort of big, broad examples, right? If the easiest way to do a grazing system is to put them in a big pasture and let them do what they want to do. And in a season-long single pasture grazing situation like that, you can actually get a lot of habitat heterogeneity or variety across space because the cows will have their favorite spots. Some of that's because it's close to water or close to shade. Some of it's because it's on the top of a hill they really like or in a little flat area that's really good. So they'll develop their favorite spots. They'll start grazing that. And then once they've been grazed, those plants become really nutritious as they grow back. So the cows keep grazing those. And at the end of the season, you tend to have some parts of the big pasture that are really heavily grazed, some parts that are really lightly grazed, and it's really uneven, which, depending on what your objectives are, that can be good or bad, right? From a habitat standpoint, it's usually pretty good. But long ago, we came up with the idea of rotational grazing largely to sort of even out the utilization across space by taking a big pasture like that and splitting it up into pieces and grazing each of those pieces in turn so that we had more control over making sure that all the areas of those pastures got grazed at some point. And none of them got too much grazing or too little bit of grazing. And that works really well from a forage standpoint. From a habitat standpoint, it can be tricky because you can, at the end of the year, depending on how you run your rotation, at the end of the season, you might look back and all of your pastures are pretty close to about the same height and density, because that's sort of the point of rotational grazing, was to even out the utilization across a pasture from a forage standpoint. But those are like the two big broad areas, right? And what we've been doing a lot with the Nature Conservancy is trying to find more variations on that theme and without losing any of the livestock productivity, try to find ways to create more variety in terms of habitat.
That's really cool because that's actually what I was going to ask you, is kind of build on that with the management regimes and how do you guys actually implement that strategically. So you create that heterogeneity in the landscape, and I think that's something, when you're thinking about prairie, I think it's really important to create that. And it's, but again, I think it goes back to what you guys are doing. What is your objective for that land? What is and starting with that? And I know we've done that
Right.
within the Awesome Lab, is really focus on, having the objective, getting that started, and then say, okay, here's what I want to achieve. Now, how do I achieve that through things like, rotational grazing or whatever? So,
Yep. Yeah. So for us, again, a lot of times we're trying to push the envelope, right? We're trying to test some ideas and see how far we can go with creating as much variety of that habitat structure as we can hopefully without sort of compromising the productivity side from a livestock standpoint. And so, in general, a lot of times what we're trying to do is we're trying to heavily utilize one area of the prairie for maybe a full season, right? It gets grazed hard for a full season, sometimes even longer. But then right after that, it goes into a cycle of rest that might last a year or two or three until it gets fully recovered. And if you look at sort of the overall average use over a 5-year period, it's going to be the same sort of amount of grazing over a 3 or 4 or 5 year period as anybody else is doing around us in terms of our neighbors. But we're taking that utilization very unevenly across space. So
Hmm.
one example of that that we didn't come up with, but that we've been using for a long time is called patch burn grazing,
Oh,
right?
sure.
Where you take a big pasture and instead of cross fencing it, you just burn a different portion of it every year. That burned area becomes really nice and green and lush. That's where the cattle focus their time. That burn patch gets grazed really hard, and then the next year you burn a different area. Cows move over to that new burn, and that the old burn patch has a couple years to recover until the fire cycle sort of returns. Really simple if you can use fire, but it does rely on fire, which means it's not as exportable, I think, to a lot of ranchers who might use fire but aren't really looking to use fire every year in every pasture. That's a lot to ask for anybody.
Sure.
But that patch burn grazing does create really great habitat, and you're also maximizing the sort of quality of forage that the cows have access to because they have a huge range of choices, right? They can go anywhere that pasture they want. They spend most of their time in that burned area because that's where the highest quality forage is. But if they want something different, either an individual plant that they want a little taste of for some reason, or if they want a little more roughage in their diet, they can go anywhere they want anytime, which is really great from the individual animal standpoint. But then what we've been trying to do is sort of work off of that theme and think about other ways to create that same pattern without relying on fire, right? I'm actually really excited about this year because we're going to start trying virtual fence as a
Oh,
way to
cool.
sort of focus animals in certain places. I think that has a huge promise, especially as the price keeps going down on it. So we're trying to get ahead of, um, work on it while it's still sort of expensive, but not as expensive as it was. See what we can learn about that. And then we've got another system, just as another quick example, that we use in a 4 pasture rotation. But instead of moving those animals one at a time through the pastures, we'll start them in one pasture. And when we open the gate to let them into the second pasture, we leave the gate open so those cows can flow back and forth. And so what we end up with is heavier utilization in that initial pasture. And then when it starts to get short and it looks like they're going to run out of grass, we give them more space. But just like in the patch burn grazing example, what they really want is that first pasture that they've been grazing because that's where that regrowth is that they really are looking for. And we just allow them to do that. And then we might use 2 pastures every year, which means you've got 2 that are in a rest cycle. So the one that gets utilized really hard then goes into that rest cycle for a couple years before it gets grazed again. Those are just examples, right? There's lots of ways to do
Sure.
it. But in general, what we find is a long period of use followed by a long rest creates a lot of variety in habitat. And also, again, in the examples I've shared, you're giving those individual animals a ton of choice about what they're eating. So it works out well from a productivity standpoint.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I guess I'll just do a quick plug. So back in December, our podcast episode was on virtual fencing with Dr. Mitch Stevenson and our former graduate student, Caitlin Dozler, who's now over in Missouri. And so, to your point, Chris, that's a great tool. We had really great success with that. And as you mentioned, prices are coming down on things. I think into the future, that does create a lot of opportunities for producers to think a little differently than maybe some of the ways they've been able to do in the past is because they may have had restrictions on things they couldn't really implement. And so it's great to hear you guys are actually implementing some of those things this year.
Yeah, we're really excited about it.
So, have you guys also implemented mowing or haying is a potential grassland management option for you guys?
Yeah, we definitely have. When I started, again, 28 years ago, a lot of the grasslands that I was managing had been hayed quite a bit. A lot of them were annually hayed. And that was really great for some species of plants and some wildlife species, right? We had upland sandpipers all over the place and a lot of those big hay prairies along the Platte River, for example. Um, but it was also very homogeneous structure across that whole site, right? If the whole prairie got hayed every year, the habitat structure was pretty much the same across it, and we were favoring the same plants every year because it was whatever had a chance to bloom and make seed before that hay mower came through did great, right? And everything after that had a harder life. So we started to vary that a little bit and used hay in a lot less. But then when we started using patch burn grazing and playing around with that idea, we'd have years where we couldn't get a fire done in a certain place because, we just never got the winds and the weather conditions we needed, or whatever just didn't work out. And we were like, well, now we need to do something to draw the cattle out of where they were last year so we don't overuse that spot. And one of the things we played with was cutting hay where we were going to burn. And we were in a flat situation where the hay mowers had access to it, and it worked pretty well to do that. And it turns out that that's a really great way to create heterogeneity also, right? We could, instead of burning, we'd come through with the hay mower, hay that down. That regrowth after the haying was attractive enough. The cows would spend their time there, and we just sort of incorporated that into the rotation. And so now we have a couple of pastures where that is the primary management tool, and it's sort of patch hay grazing or whatever you want to call it, right? It's just another way of creating a focal patch that those cows are really interested in that allows them to graze that and rest other areas.
Is there a reason why you prefer haying those pastures over burning them? Is it just hard to get a burn off there, or what's the reason for?
Yeah, I mean, both ways work fine. I think a lot of it depends on, for us at the Nature Conservancy, we do a lot of fire, but fire takes a lot of our time. And there are some years where, you go through an entire 3 or 4 month period and you get 2 or 3 days that the weather works out for burning. And that means we get 3 burns done. And so part of the original idea was to sort of reduce the number of burns we felt like we had to do so we could focus on the priorities, right? We've got a pasture over here that's getting some cedar trees bigger. We really need to get that one burned. Let's make sure we have time to do that. And if we do a burn over here, great. If we don't, we'll just cut it for hay, right? Um,
Sure.
and the other piece of that is economically, from a rancher's perspective, you get some income off of off of cutting hay. Um,
That's true. Yeah.
and so it's sort of a nice thing. The problem is, of course, if you have rough topography, haying doesn't work. So that would be where you could prioritize, right? If you've got a pasture with rougher topography, maybe that's where fire makes more sense. And if you've got one that's flatter, you could cut hay. Maybe you'd play with haying more.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So you briefly touched on some upland sandpiper type stuff, talking about those hay meadows and how they did really well in the haying system. About how many species, or do you have an idea of how many species from insects all the way up to ungulates, how many species we have within a healthy prairie?
I mean, thousands, right? Most of those are invertebrates, right? And I'm not counting bacteria and fungi and all those, which, that'd take us into the millions probably. But um, yeah, I mean, I would say if we had, let's say we have a 300-acre pasture, right? Whether that's split into pieces or not, you got 300 acres of pasture land. I would hope that we could go out and find, 8 or 10 different species of birds that are nesting on the ground out in those grasslands that are really dependent on grasslands for their habitat. And some of them are going to be in the shorter areas where we've cut hay or burned and the grazing's really heavy. Some of those are going to be in the fully rested areas, and some will be in between. But then if you start thinking about, small mammals like mice, which are crucial for like the food supply for a lot of our bigger wildlife, right? You'll probably have 8 or 10 species of those or more. And then you start thinking about lizards and snakes, and just from a vertebrate standpoint, you're getting, up around that 40 or 50 number pretty quickly. And then, boy, like we said, when you throw in butterflies and grasshoppers and beetles and all those sorts of things, each of those also has their own preferences for different types of habitat structure. So they'll be placed in different areas of that pasture. But within that 300-acre pasture, if all those habitat types are available, there's an incredible diversity. And then again, plants, right? You might have 150 different species of plants or two or more just in that same 300 acres.
That's really cool. Yeah, and like as you mentioned, yeah, it's kind of there's all kinds of interesting things there. And I guess I'm curious, just from your perspective, and then just the TNC and kind of the mission and what you guys are doing. Obviously a lot of this comes back to that connection to the land. So
Right.
seeing the diversity as you just described, and so just from your own personal perspective, what are some of the observations that you've seen that are really kind of highlight that importance and kind of making that connection, and then in turn basically sharing that connection or that story to other landowners. So, and because I hear stories, I'll give you an illustration. Like I've had landowners say, well, I remember when I would hear quail as a kid out in the back here, and then just kind of making some of those connections to them saying, well, maybe I don't hear that. So what do I need to do to bring that back? So
Mm.
I'm just curious if you have any kind of interesting little stories or things that you guys kind of share with other landowners to kind of make those connection points.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have a quarter section of land that has been in our family for a while that I manage now, mostly grassland. And so I've been playing around with a lot of these same ideas there. And I'll just use the upland sandpiper as the example because we've talked about it. But, upland sandpipers like to nest in big areas of short grass. But it's actually similar to quail. They're they use different habitats through the year, right? So where they nest is not necessarily where they want to take their kids when their kids are old enough to move
Sure.
and to
Yeah.
go feed, right? So they
Yep.
in our pasture, what was really neat was we had nesting in one area, but then uh, after the nesting season, the upland sandpipers took off and I didn't see them. And then a few days later, I was out walking around and I was looking at the area we had grazed really hard the previous year. And it looked kind of weedy. There was a lot of Western ragweed that was doing really well because it had been released from competition by the grasses being short. Um, and daisy fleabane and curly cup gumweed, all these sort of annual plants. And that's where the upland sandpiper was. And I got to
Hmm.
watch this upland sandpiper mom or dad, I can't tell, with the chick running around and
That's
they were
cool.
feeding, kind of running in between those ragweed patches because the grass was short. So it was real easy to run around in it. But there was enough cover that they had some
Sure.
protection from predators. But because the grass was short and there was a lot of bare ground, the insect numbers were high. I mean, it was just the exact perfect spot, right? And so that relates to quail the same
Sure.
way, right? Quail are going to
Absolutely.
nest in more of a dense habitat, but then they need that same, a real similar type of habitat to move around in.
Yep.
They might look for a patch of shrubs. And so it's the same concept. It's that variability of habitat. And if you have a lot of that placed, close enough to each other, then those animals have choices about where to move, sometimes between seasons, sometimes just within the same day, right?
Sure.
You go out. I like going out in the snow, same place or any other place. Go out in the snow in the wintertime and watch where mice tracks go
Hmm.
and watch where they go from when they come out of their hole in the snow and what direction they go. And they often go to somewhere that looks different from where their hole in the snow is, right? They work along these boundaries and they'll go out into something else to feed, and then they come back to where they were, spending the night or huddling down in the snow or whatever. And you just see that all the time. Um, and then from a plant standpoint, I don't know how many times I've been surprised where I know a piece of ground really well. I've been managing it myself for, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years or more. And yet I'll go out in a particular year and I'll see a plant that I've never seen. And I'm somebody that looks very closely at plants. I teach plant identification. Plants are a thing that I pay attention to, but I'm often surprised by seeing a plant that I've never seen. And usually when I see it, I have at least a pretty good idea of why it's there, and it usually ties back to management. We did
Sure.
something different the previous year that changed the growing conditions, the same changed the habitat structure. And so there's a plant called Carolina anemone. It's just a little tiny plant, grows very early in the spring. Most people have never seen them. The first time I ever saw one was the spring after we did a summer prescribed fire.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that summer prescribed fire is the only way to get it to bloom because I've seen it now bloom in other places. But in that particular pasture, whatever happened after that summer fire and the grazing that followed on top of that, that was the first time that plant ever showed up. And this is a perennial plant. It had been there, it had been alive for many years. It just never had a chance to flower. And all of a sudden, just like that, it flowered, right? And I love seeing those examples of something that has been released from whatever was holding it back because of a choice or a decision that we made, right? And
Sure.
then this cascade of impacts, or, we decided to do a summer fire that affected the way the cattle grazed it. Because the cattle grazed it, that affected the habitat structure. And then all of a sudden, this plant was able to flower and do something different. That's just so much fun.
No, that's awesome, and that is actually what illustrates my point to that connection to land, the excitement that you're showing right there. Just that, hey, I did this, and then look at some of these things that are happening, and I think that's that connection point. I know Aldo Leopold talks a lot about that in his books, and thinking about ways that you can look at that and say, okay, hey, I'm making progress. I'm trying to achieve whatever objective I'm wanting to achieve, and I also really like your point about just even if you don't know all the species of plants out there, you can start learning. There's apps, you can reach out to resource professionals, et
Yep.
cetera, and start, learning about, hey, pick like three or four things out there and say, I want to learn a little more about the value of those plants. And then you continue to build your kind of your repertoire of all the different things out there, your experiences of, okay, if I do this, here's some things that may impact, these species of plants or whatever, but then also knowing and gaining more knowledge about what's available out there for wildlife. So that's awesome.
Well, and what you just said is so important because a lot of the changes that we see in a landscape that are a reaction to something we've done as a land manager, it starts with the way the plant community changes, right? The different plant species that are expressing themselves or thriving that particular year. So if you don't know your plant species or haven't taken the time to look at them very closely, you miss so much that's happening.
Sure,
And
absolutely.
when you miss that, you miss the opportunities to see what the land is trying to tell you about how it likes or doesn't like or is reacting to your management, right? So, like you said, just learning some of the basic plants or even just going out often enough that you can see that wildflower is different than this one.
Sure,
And I saw this one after we did this, and I saw that one after we did this, and that's really interesting. I mean, if nothing else, I mean, so A, I think it's important in terms of helping you evaluate what's happening. But even if that wasn't the case, life is just more fun when you can see things that are happening that
sure.
other people are don't recognize, right? And I look back now, 10, 20, 30 years ago and think about all the things that I didn't notice or didn't think about. I mean, I already talked about I didn't think about grasslands, but just knowing the more I learn every year, the more I see and the more exciting and interesting life is.
That's cool. That's awesome. Yeah, thanks, Chris, for sharing that. I really appreciate that. I think it's such an important aspect to think about and make that connection point.
So, Chris, you mentioned that plants are able to hold on maybe for long periods of time if the cover or the conditions aren't right for them to bloom. How do wildlife fare? I mean, we know some wildlife can move around and find habitats on the landscape, but is there ever concern after you implement a practice that, hey, maybe we just did something terrible for a lot of species that were there by killing them or something like that?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking me that. I mean, we definitely think about that all the time. And, I mentioned a summer fire earlier. A lot of people would think about burning in the summer and think, well, that's just weird and dumb and
Hmm,
potentially damaging and you're wasting forage. And maybe all those things are true, but it is something that, again, it created something different and we saw some really interesting results from it. But when we do summer fires like that, which we do periodically, we always do it on a pretty small percentage of the total, right? Because if there is anything that's hurt by that fire, for example, I don't want to wipe out an entire population of something. And so we have a kind of a general rule of thumb that a summer fire is usually 10% or less than a full pasture, for example, right? It's just something a little bit interesting. Sometimes as we have a little patch of cedar trees that we missed in another fire, we want to come back and get it, or we're just trying to change the way the grazers are moving around, and so we can throw a little fire out there in the summer. But we restrict the size of that. But I would also say like cutting hay, right, has huge consequences from a let's say from a pollinator standpoint, right? If you've got a 100-acre hay meadow and you cut all 100 acres and all the flowers on 100 acres disappear, all the bees that were relying on that and all the butterflies and everything else have nothing, right? And if you're
sure.
depending on what your neighbors are doing, that could be a real catastrophe for those individual species. And so, like you said, Nate, I mean, a lot of animals can move around. And if you change the habitat in a certain place, a good number of them will move and find what they need somewhere else. Not all of them can. Some of them are tied to a nest or tied to a particular location, or they're just not very mobile. So some of them are going to have trouble, but a lot of them, even if their population goes down for a while, they can recover. But you can mitigate a lot of that impact just by making sure that you're not doing the same thing across the whole area, right? That you've always got other types of habitat nearby. And sometimes that doesn't have to be on your land. Sometimes you can look across the fence and you say, oh, my neighbor's got, a bunch of tall grass. So if I get rid of a bunch of my grass this year and cut it short for whatever reason, I feel good that at least there's still some habitat around in the neighborhood for the things that need that, right? So you can look at the sort of the larger landscape context.
That's really good. Yeah, I like to think of it as like a quilt, kind of
Yeah.
creating that patchy mosaic, if you want to say, and just kind of like different like squares in a quilt.
Yep.
And I think it's a really good illustration there of kind of, yeah, you don't want to take and remove everything necessarily. You want to maybe like, I like your point, 10%. That's a great number to kind of target and say, hey, this is kind of what we're doing. And then just looking at maybe, hey, the surrounding landscape, your neighbors, what are they doing? And that's why, I like to take like a landscape level look at your property and look at what the neighbors, because there's always, strengths and weaknesses of every property. And
Yep.
so you got to think about the bigger picture. So in my mind,
Well, and I would take your quilt analogy and expand on it a little bit because we talk about a mosaic, right? So same idea. You
sure,
got a mosaic of all
sure,
these different types of patches, but we also talk about a shifting mosaic because you want the habitat types to not be in the same place every year,
yep,
just for a lot of the same reasons that you rotate crops in a garden or a field, right?
sure,
If you do the same thing in the same place, you're always favoring the same plant species, and eventually you're going to have some that fall out. You're going to have the opportunity for disease organisms to build up in big numbers because you always have the same conditions year after year. Predators sort of develop patterns. All these things just sort of happen that can sort of depress the number of species that can thrive in that area. Even if the habitat structure looks great for a particular species, if it's been that way for 4 years in a row or 10 years in a row, there's probably something that's not great for that particular species. And so shaking things up, moving things around the landscape has a lot of benefits.
Yeah, and you mentioned the benefits to the not only that grassland ecosystem, but what about livestock health? Have you noticed any benefits in keeping that diversity for your livestock as opposed to what other producers might see?
Yeah, I mean it's tricky, right? Because we know that cattle, for example, eat a lot of different kinds of plants. People think about cattle as grass feeders, and they are. They eat a lot of grass, but depending on what research study you look at and what conditions they're under, a quarter to even half of their intake can be wildflowers, other non-grass species. Um, and we were talking earlier about the choice that cattle get, and a lot of the examples that I gave of what we try, where they have access to a large area. They're focusing most of their grazing in one place, but if they want something or need something else, they can go get it. I think there's a lot of benefit to that, not just in terms of whether they're eating short grass or tall grass, but the ability to self-medicate, the ability to fill a nutrient gap. Cattle are amazing at sort of recognizing what their nutritional needs are, recognizing the feedback loop. I ate this, I feel this way now because of it. And so the more the more diversity of plants you have, the more you allow those animals to move around and find what they want rather than constraining them to a small area, the better you're likely to see the individual health of an animal be. Which doesn't mean that, a fast moving rotation is bad for animals necessarily, but you do take a lot of the choices away from them because you squeeze them into a small area, right? And you say, you're going to eat what's in front of you because that's what I'm going to allow you to eat. And just philosophically for me, I feel like I like thinking about our animals and the choices that they have. And then also, again, getting back to just what's interesting, it's really interesting to watch what choices they make when you give them those choices and watching what plants they're eating today versus yesterday. And then trying to guess, what is it about today that's different, right? Did it eat that goldenrod that they never eat, it seems like? Did they chop off half the goldenrod in this patch because it tasted good, because it was at the right stage of growth to be good this today? Or was it because they just felt like it? Or was there a nutritional need that they picked up some zinc from that or whatever
sure.
it was, right? It's really fascinating to try to guess what's going on in the brains of those animals.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think one of the neat things about TNC here in Nebraska is that you guys also have bison too.
Right. Yep.
So how does a bison stack up to a cow out in the prairie? Are they grazing the same things? Do you see the same feedback mechanisms from them after they're in an area? Can you speak on that a little?
Yeah, for sure. They're very similar in a lot of ways. I mean, there's some big behavioral differences, but in terms of diet, bison are a little bit more selective toward grasses, but they still eat a good percentage of their diet as other things. Um, and at least in our pastures, we have our cattle are in pastures that range from, 50 acres to several hundred acres to a few that are, a section or two. But our bison run in two pastures. One is 10,000 acres, one is 12,000, where they have access to basically that entire huge area, right? And so we definitely get to see what they choose when they have free choice.
Sure.
And often we're trying to burn different pieces and, focus their grazing, but they can do whatever they want within those big areas. Um, and they definitely will pick out favorite plants. They have favorite areas that they pick out depending on where we burned also. But when you compare them to cattle, um, both of them are, here's one thing I love. I love thinking about both bison and cattle grazing in the summertime because in the summertime, when it's really hot during the day, a lot of grazing actually happens at night. And so not only are they being selective, and you can go out in the pasture and you can see how much they've chosen to eat one little patch of grass and leave the wildflower right next to it, or they grazed off one wildflower all the way to the ground, but left the different species right next to it untouched, right? They're being incredibly selective. And I just love the fact that in the summertime, a lot of that selectivity happens in the dark at night,
Oh, sure.
which just gives me so much more respect for those animals, right? Whatever process they use to pick out what they want, bite by bite by bite, they can not only do it, they can do it in the dark, which is just
Absolutely.
staggering to me.
Which is amazing. Yeah, that's truly amazing.
But so behaviorally, there are some differences, right? So one example is bison don't tend to stand around in the water like cattle do. They don't seek that out to get rid of flies in their legs or whatever. They also don't hang around trees all that much. Cattle enjoy spending some time sitting in the shade, getting out of that heat. Bison really don't do that. If they go into the shade, it's because they're on the way to somewhere else usually, or they want something to rub against, and then they take off. When they trail, cattle cattle will take an easy way up a slope, right? They'll kind of go at an angle like we would and go back and forth and sort of switch back up and down a hill. And a lot of times bison just go straight up and down. And from an erosion standpoint, that can actually be sort of a disadvantage, right? We see more erosion sometimes on slopes because bison are going straight up and down that hill. They just power right up. Um, None of those things really are big downsides one way or the other. I mean, cattle and bison can both be great options depending on what you want to do. Um, but like if you have a stream that you're concerned about having too many animals in, with cattle, you sort of need to fence it out and think about how you're going to keep them out, which, by the way, virtual fence gives us a ton of options, which are exciting there.
Absolutely.
With bison, you just don't have to worry about that because they're just not going to camp out in that little creek very often. Um, so, yeah, both of them are good. I would say that the last example of that with bison, at least the way most people handle bison in Nebraska and the Great Plains, most people own those animals and you have to manage them year round, which changes the way you have to think about stocking rate. They don't need a lot of help over the winter, which is great. I mean, they just sort of go into the winter and push the snow out of the way to get the brown grass that they need to stay alive. They come out of the winter lighter but in good shape. Where obviously with cattle, you've got to find something different to do with them. And a lot like for us, all of our cattle come from our neighbors through leases, but we have those bison year round. We have to make sure we're keeping the fences up and water open, all those sort of things. So it changes sort of the way that your management year looks depending on whether you're running bison or cattle.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and I appreciate you giving that difference there between the two because I think a lot of folks may not really know that because we're not necessarily running a lot of bison in the landscape per se. At
Yeah.
least the average person is not. So that's great.
So on that 10,000 acre or your larger pastures, do you have just as much management to get those bison to move around as you would cattle, or not?
Yeah, I mean it's basically the same idea. We could run cattle on that same pasture as well, um, and it would probably work fine. It'd be harder to check cows every day. There are days where we take people out to see the bison because they come and they stop by and say, "Hey, can we go out and look at them?" Say, "Yeah, yeah, we'll go look," and we might not find them because we're in sand hills and it's 10,000 acres and who knows where they are, right?
Sure.
But yeah, in terms of management, if we had cattle in 10,000 acres and we burned one portion of that every year, those cattle would act just like the bison are, and they would spend, 60, 80% of their time in that burn patch, and then they'd wander around a little bit beyond that. So the management's not really that different day to day.
That's cool.
Oh, one thing I was going to back up to, if that's okay.
Absolutely, please.
We were talking about the reasons that variety matters and that having a lot of different plant species are important. I was just going to say, I think one way I think about that is, I mentioned the redundancy built in if you have a lot of different species. So, as an example, right, if if you hit a dry year and you need a bunch of species that are good at growing in dry soil conditions, it feels the same way. If you're into sports, it's like having bench strength, right? Like you might have some players that you don't use all the time, but when a certain condition happens in the game, you need them to be there so you can put them in the game and they can do their job for you, right? They're not always the all-stars, but they're important. And I feel like that's the same way with the plant community, for example, where in those dry years, you need those specialty players who have been just sort of sitting there, not doing a whole lot over the last several years while it's been, good rainfall. And all of a sudden they become the most important people of the team or the players on the team. And you're really glad you have them, right? But also the same thing, like even through a season, I mentioned earlier goldenrod. Goldenrod is not a plant you think of cattle grazing very hard, but I see cattle graze goldenrod at important times of the year or some years and not others. I don't know why they're making those decisions, but I bet those cows are really glad that there's a little goldenrod in the pasture when they get a taste for it or have a need for it or whatever. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that bench strength idea because I do think that's a good way to helpfully maybe help people think about that concept.
Well, and that's a good point and got me thinking about something, just bench strength. That probably ties a lot to blowouts and probably those early colonizing species, sure. Right? Maybe like ring muley, I think might be one, or blowout penstemon, stuff that you don't find elsewhere. Yep. That really only thrives in a blowout scenario.
Yeah. So if you want that sand to stop moving, you're awfully grateful for those plants that for some reason or somehow can grow, getting beat up by loose grains of sand blowing in their faces all day. They somehow find a way to root themselves down and they can stabilize that ground. And yeah, once that ground gets stabilized, they sort of fade away and you don't notice them again anymore until they're needed again.
So does that mean their seeds are in the seed bank for who knows how many years just sitting there?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, seed bank is really important typically for short-lived plants. Short-lived plants like annuals and biennials really rely on the seed bank, and they do exactly what you said. They get 1 year to grow if you're an annual, and you've got to germinate from a seed, you got to grow, you got to flower, you got to make seeds, and you dump those seeds out in the world, hoping that you put so many out there that when the conditions are right, they'll be able to germinate and grow again. But it might be 5-10 years before the conditions come around. But in our grasslands here in Nebraska, a big percentage, the majority of our plants are perennials, so they live year after year after year. And what's really fascinating about that is that their annual growth starts at the base of the plant every year from a bud. So just like the buds on a tree branch that, they open up in the spring and then that branch gets a little longer. That's what happens with woody plants, but with these herbaceous plants, things like grasses and wildflowers, those buds start at the base every year, and the new growth always starts from the base of the plant, starts from the ground, right? And so instead of a seed bank, what you really are thinking about is more of a bud bank, where at the base of a plant, you might have 4 or 5, maybe 10 different buds that can be deployed when needed, right? And sometimes those are deployed in the middle of the season. If a plant gets grazed off really short, rather than growing up again from the same stalk, it might deploy a new bud and grow out from the side and grow another stem from there. But definitely at the beginning of each year, one of those buds has to be able to deploy for that plant to grow. And all the plant has to do to survive, I mean, assuming it doesn't get dug up by a badger or something, right? Sure. All it has to do to survive is create enough energy from the sun to make one bud at the base of itself, and it'll be able to go again next year. And so the way a perennial plant dies usually is it gets overutilized by chronic overgrazing, for example, and it just runs out of energy to create a bud and then it just can't grow anymore. But assuming that doesn't happen, this is really cool to think about, I think. Assuming that doesn't happen, that plant is essentially immortal, right? As long as it creates a new bud every year, it can do that for 1,000 years or more. That's awesome. I like to give foresters a hard time because they can prove how old their trees are, but using logic, I'm pretty sure there's a lot of prairie plants out there that are much older than the oldest tree on earth, but we don't have any way to prove it because we don't have tree rings. All we can say is, yeah, but they've been making buds.
Sure.
And just as a last thing, so just to build on that, right? There's also these things called rhizomes, which are underground stems. So a lot of these plants are clonal, meaning You have one stem and then you got this little rhizome and there's another stem and they can be connected. And over, again, hundreds of years, for example, that plant could get many, many acres in size. And then it really is immortal. I mean, what's going to take it out at that point? No badger in the world can dig up a 10-acre plant. And so, as long as one bud on one of those stems in that 10-acre plant deploys every year, that plant's going to keep living. That's
Yeah,
staggering, right? I mean,
that's
that's just
amazing.
amazing. And so,
Yeah.
getting back to bench strength, that plant's going to be there, right? Even if it's not having a great year, even if it's not flowering for several years in a row, one of those buds somewhere is going to be able to deploy when it's needed, and probably lots of those buds. And so, some of it's from seed, some of it's from that bud bank, circling back to what you actually asked me. Um, but those things combined make sure that the plants are there when you need them. As long as you don't do something to get rid of them, they'll be there.
Which, Chris, I think is such an excellent point you made because essentially, that stuff is there in the seed bank, and we don't have to necessarily you want to obviously through management, we want to set back those plants through a successional process, but at the same time, it's not like you're having to go necessarily always go out and buy something and put it on
Right.
the ground. You can take and say, hey, I'm going to do this management. I'm going to see these native plants that were here and been here, like you just mentioned, literally for generations, come out. And I think that's one of also the coolest parts is when people start seeing that, oh, I can do some management and look at this cool stuff that's here. I didn't even know this was here. And I think
Exactly.
that's awesome. So I
Yep.
appreciate you sharing that point.
Yeah.
So we've touched on the benefits of landscape heterogeneity to wildlife and even landowners or folks with livestock. Can you touch on some of the benefits just to society as a whole of why we need to or why we should care about healthy prairies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say the first one is that they're fascinating. I mean, we've just been talking about some of that, right? Just knowing that that exists, I think, is enough. I think for those of us who get to live on prairies or interact with them all the time, I can't imagine what life would be without that and the ability to watch the wildlife moving around and watch those plants come and go and change year to year. So I would start with that always, that I think that's the most important piece. And then, of course, on top of that, they're building soil organic matter. They're making these very productive soils that can support livestock, as well as all the wildlife and plants that we're talking about. Um, things like water filtration. We notice when you take a landscape and you convert it from grassland to something else, you notice that the water flows differently. You tend to lose soil on steeper slopes. There's just a lot of those things that prairies just sort of do in the background, and we don't think about it until we do something different and take them out, and then we notice those differences pretty quickly. So I think there's a lot of those, and obviously just the uh, the impacts of plants in terms of um, you know taking in carbon dioxide and putting out oxygen. I mean, all those things matter too. Um, and we talk a lot about the sort of societal benefits of forests, just because I think that's what most people think of when they think of nature and what nature gives us, right? It's always forests and your rainforest and all that, which is also that's great. But grasslands do the same thing. Um, so yeah, I think there's a lot of those big societal benefits. But again, to me, when I try to tell somebody why prairies matter and why they should be interested in prairies or care about prairies, I always start with why they're fascinating first, just because I think that's an easier way to connect. Um,
Sure.
and then you can bang them with facts later, and talk about why they should care from a financial standpoint or whatever. But it's really like being able to watch all the things that happen is the best part.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know like we have a project on with prairie strips. We're putting them back into corn and soybean fields right now.
Yeah.
And when we're doing using the PBT style time lapse cameras to kind of tell that story. Because, for folks, if you're starting kind of from square one, and you have nothing out there and you're kind of restoring that prairie to that landscape, it takes time, as you just mentioned earlier, but then just those overall the ecosystem services you were just describing from like, for example, the water, retention and water runoff and how, people put them kind of on the downslope, for example, water comes down that field and it begins to kind of run along that because you got those prairie plants that have, in some cases, could be several feet deep, those roots. For different plants. And so, again, that's some of the cool things that maybe you don't necessarily always see there, but just great benefits to society. So
Well, and you can see that in your own yard, right? I mean,
sure, that's true. Yeah,
we just moved across town. I live in Aurora, right? We just moved across town. We have a new yard that's pretty much all bluegrass. And I'm really looking forward to the process over the next several years of adding a bunch of native plants and
that's cool.
seeing how many things start to show up in the yard, whether
Yep,
it's, some of it'll be big stuff like rabbits and birds and things, but a lot of it's going to be different insect species that
sure.
we had at our last house, and I'm looking forward to, you know, seeing what it takes to get them now to come over to our house here. It'll be really neat. It just makes life more interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah. That and the aesthetics of that is just
Hmm.
amazing. So you can just go out there and have a cup of coffee and just enjoy that landscape. So
Yep.
that's awesome to share that.
Well, and I think it's neat that you're even implementing natives back into your yard in town, Chris. And I think that goes to show for landowners out there that maybe only have a small acreage, 1 to 10 acres. I mean, they can still make a difference and implement tactics to create landscape heterogeneity. Can you give some folks just on a smaller scale some guidance?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, exactly what you said. Even a tiny little space can make a really big impact. I mean, you think about my yard here, just on the real small scale, right? Let's just think about monarch butterflies. During the fall, when monarch butterflies are migrating south, they're desperate for food. So they've got to have wildflowers of different kinds to get nectar out of. And think about how many monarchs you see in town because they just come through wherever, right? And so being able to be like a little oasis or a little food stand or whatever for a monarch makes me feel pretty good. And that's really neat to
Absolutely.
watch them. And it's not just them. There's other migratory insects. There's all kinds of insects that'll show up in a small area. I think, at a little larger scale, if you've got, like you said, an acre or 10 acres or something like that, um, a couple things. One, again, look at your neighborhood and think about like what's provided already in this landscape, and also more importantly, what's missing, right? And maybe what's missing is a real flowery spot for pollinators, or maybe what's missing is some short structure for bees that need access to the soil for nests, or upland sandpipers, or whatever birds you're interested in, horned larks. But what's missing on the landscape? What can I do with my 1 acre, 10 acres, whatever, to complement what else is around me? That's one really important thing. And then I think the second piece, even if you do that, like we talked about earlier, don't do the same thing every year. And if you really want to support a lot of invertebrates and other wildlife species, let's say you have 5 acres and it's surrounded by crop field or towns or whatever, something else that's not habitat for a lot of those species. You do want to be really careful as much as possible not to do something across that whole 5 acre piece, whether that's fire, mowing, whatever it is. Because if you remove all of the habitat on that island in the middle of a bunch of nothing else for habitat, anything that needs that habitat is probably going to disappear. And it's not super likely that a lot of those are going to be able to make their way back in. So once they're there, you want to make sure you keep them. And it makes life a little bit more complicated, I think more interesting, but definitely more complicated when you try to think, okay, how do I break this 5 acres into a shifting mosaic, right?
Sure.
Um, and let's say that mowing is your best management option, right? 5 acres, you could do some grazing, but it gets trickier. There's a lot of fence for a 5 acre piece. Um, but you can remember things like, A, you don't have to mow straight lines.
Yep.
We always tend to go straight lines and blocks and squares. Like there's no
Yeah.
requirement for that. You can mow curly cues through the habitat just to create something interesting, right? But you can also change the height of the mower. So
Yep.
maybe you mow in areas and you've got some areas you mow high and some areas you mow low. You're going to mow some areas in the early part of the year and leave some. And then later in the year, you go back and mow some of the stuff you left before and let that early stuff grow. And you can create a real variety of structure, even within a pretty small space, just by being thoughtful about it. And
Yep.
again, not getting locked into our human desire to like make it all look neat and tidy in the same way, right? Make
Yep.
it messy. Messy is the best thing you can do for a lot of wildlife species.
That's perfect because I really I love that idea, and I think because one of the things we find, especially for some of our predators, for example, like a coyote, they like very linear paths. So creating that diversity, it doesn't have to be. We have this mentality, and has to be a certain way, it has to be exactly in lines, as you mentioned. But no, I would argue it does not. I think it needs to kind of meandering around with the mower. And as you mentioned, it's great illustrations of, different heights of that as you're mowing. Just yeah, messy. I like that idea.
Yeah,
That's
let's make those
perfect.
coyotes work for their living. Come on now.
Yeah, that's absolutely, yeah.
We don't want lazy coyotes.
Yeah. That's really good.
Yeah, I think that's great advice that I'll be pointing a lot of small time landowners to who, I mean, a lot of the time reach out to Pheasants Forever and just say, what can I do out here to benefit game birds or pollinators or things like that? So I think that's definitely great advice.
I think the last thing, just on that, the last thing is to be careful about your expectations, right? You're not gonna, if you have a 5 acre patch of habitat surrounded by non-habitat, you're not gonna get prairie chickens, right? There's just some things
Sure.
you're not gonna get, but that doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. And you want to focus on what can I do with this piece? What are the and this is where talking to biologists with Pheasants Forever or whoever, right, can be helpful. Like what should I expect to be able to support here? And then you can focus on that and just make sure that you're not trying to achieve something that's just not going to happen because that can be
Sure.
depressing. But if you get out of that, it's great fun, right? To see what you can do with
Absolutely.
that little patch of habitat.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I appreciate that, Chris, because that managing expectations is really key. And then taking, hey, if you start building some momentum on your property,
Yeah,
talk to your neighbor, have a conversation with them. Hey, have you thought about doing this? And then creating
absolutely.
kind of like I like to say, kind of these stepping stones. The more we can do that, it may not be a perfect ripple in the pond effect, but the more we can start building kind of this landscape scale management effort, the better. And then
Yep.
those animals can move, and maybe historically they weren't able to make it to your property because there was no connectivity from one patch to another, but now there is because you and your neighbors are all kind of collectively working together. So
Yeah, and then you can sit around on your porches and talk about all the new things you're seeing.
absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, and to that point, just because you're not able to help prairie chickens or pheasants or quail, that doesn't mean you're not greatly benefiting pollinators or small
Yep,
mammals,
Yep.
like which you said are extremely important for a grassland ecosystem.
absolutely.
And one of the things that I think you do really well, and Chris, that I follow along, I love all of your prairie insect stuff that you post
Uh,
about,
Mm.
especially in your 1 meter by 1 meter plot blog that I would urge people to follow you on that, which is the Prairie Ecologist, right?
yep. Yeah, I'm kind of a weirdo, but hopefully an interesting one. I I got a macro lens for my camera almost 30 years ago, which let me start taking pictures of small things, and that just it rocked my world, and it still continues to this day. I mean, every time I take a picture of something I've never seen before, I'll look it up, try to
Mm.
figure out what it is, and the stories are always interesting, always fascinating, no matter what species it is.
Mm. That's cool.
Yes, 100%. I thoroughly enjoy it, and I've learned quite a bit. Is there anything else that we may have missed? I mean, I know there's plenty of stuff in prairies that we could talk about, but any other points that you would like to bring up while you're here?
I don't think so. I think yeah, like you said, we talked about a whole range of things. I guess I would reiterate that idea that we just talked about of having what feels like maybe is a small impact can really be important. I mean, if everybody had 5 acres and everybody managed it for good habitat, imagine what we'd be working with, right?
Absolutely.
Um, and even more, I think it's important to do something good for the world, but it also is really important to do something to make yourself feel good and feel
Yep.
happy. And when people ask, what should I plant in my yard? It's like, I don't know, what do you like? Right? What do you want to get
Sure.
up every morning and look at?
Sure.
And if you want habitat for butterflies, great, make habitat for butterflies. And if that includes, penstemons and a bunch of native plants, but you also like zinnias, throw some zinnias in the mix. That's great. Do
Yep.
what makes you happy. Stay away from invasive plants, but
Yep.
zinnias are going to be fine. They're not going to take over the world.
Yep. No, that's a great point.
Yeah, do what makes you happy. I like that. If anybody wanted to follow along with TNC and kind of learn with you guys, I know you guys are big on education.
Sure.
Where would they go to find some of your resources?
So our website is nature.org. And if you go to nature.org/Nebraska, that takes you right to where we're doing work in Nebraska. We have a volunteer program if you want to come out and do something with us, 2 Saturday mornings every month. We've got volunteer activities at our Platte River prairies, west of Grand Island, and we're hoping to build something similar at our Niobrara Valley Preserve up north. Um, like you said, the prairieecologist.com is my blog. I try to write things quite a bit there and share some of the work we're doing, but also just things that I see that are interesting and that other people might find interesting. So those are a couple of good ways to go.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. I greatly appreciate you coming on and talking about prairies with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.